Good evening, everyone. My name is Chelsea Ferranti. I am the homicide investigator working on the JonBenet Ramsey case. Tonight we are going to be discussing the autopsy report of JonBenet that we just received back from the medical examiner. Before we begin, there is a term that you're going to hear me frequently referring to or frequently using throughout the evaluation of this report. I just want you to be familiar with the term and fully understand it. So the term is petechial hemorrhage. Petechial hemorrhage is indicated by the presence of tiny brownish purplish spots located on the skin or throughout the body. Now they indicate bleeding under the skin. It happens when tiny blood vessels break or are ruptured, and it's often associated with trauma such as strangulation. Now, the initial autopsy examination was conducted on December 26, 1996 at 8:20 p.m. at the location of 755 15th Street in Boulder, Colorado. The initial exam lasted 10 minutes and was conducted by Dr. John E. Mayer. No one else was listed as being present on this initial exam. The results of the initial exam are not clear in the report, but evidence of ligature markings around the victim's neck and her right wrist were noted, as well as a small area of abrasion or contusion below the right ear on the outside portion of the right cheek. A second, more in-depth examination was done the next day on December 27th, 1996, and this was done at the medical examiner's office. The exam again was conducted by Dr. John E. Mayer, and it wasn't until after the second examination that a cause of death was determined. For those of you who aren't familiar with JonBenet or this case, JonBenet was a 6-year-old Caucasian female who weighed 45 pounds and was 47 inches or 3 feet 11 inches tall. She lived at home with her mother, her father, and her older brother. Now, upon external examination of JonBenet's body, there was significant evidence of injury located on the face, the neck, and other parts of the body. Located on JonBenet's head, right below her right ear at the angle of her jaw, there is noted to be a rust-colored abrasion. Also found during the external exam of JonBenet were multiple locations of petechial hemorrhaging. Locations include, but are not limited to, the upper and lower inside portion of the left eyelid, the skin of the upper eyelids on both eyes, the left cheek, and the front of her left shoulder. Now, Dr. Mayer also makes note that there's possible petechial hemorrhaging on the right side of the face, but he is unable to make a definitive identification due to the presence of livor mortis. Now, the biggest evidence of injury noted externally was a deep ligature furrow encircling the entire neck. The ligature furrow was horizontal in orientation with a slight upward deviation. So it went this way and slightly up. We know that it had a slight upward deviation because the measurement from the midline or the center of the ligature mark on the anterior portion of JonBenet measured 8 inches from the top of the head to the middle of the ligature mark, whereas on the back of her, it measured from the top of the head to from the back of the head to the middle of the ligature mark was 6.7 inches, so just a little bit shorter. There's also evidence of petechial hemorrhaging and multiple abrasions located above and below the furrows on the front portion of the neck. There is mention of many non-pattern abrasions near the ligature marks and one particular abrasion in triangular shape. This triangular shape abrasion is located just left of the midline of the neck, and it measures 1.5 inches by 0.75 inches. And it is obliquely oriented with the apex superior and lateral. So what this means is the triangular pattern is turned sideways, and the pointed end of the triangle is just outside and slightly above or higher than the ligature mark. Now there is mention of other abrasions and contusions located laterally and posteriorly on JonBenet, so on her sides and on her back. And then we move into notes on the external exam that were evidence of injury to the vagina, which may be evidence of sexual assault. These injuries include, but are not limited to, dried blood located on the edges of the labia majora, or the external lips of the vagina, as well as just inside the vaginal opening. Hyperemia, or trauma of some kind to the blood vessels in that area of the vaginal, were found in the vaginal opening and extending into the vagina. The hymen of the 6-year-old girl is also worth mentioning. It is present and it is intact from the 10 to 2 location or positions, but there is trauma in the presence of an abrasion at the 7 o'clock position. Also of note, the right labia majora, again the external lip of the vagina, has a violet discoloration measuring 1 inch by 3/8 of an inch. Also of note, semi-liquid, thin, watery red fluid was found present in this prepubescent vagina. There was no other mention of injuries in this external exam, including no trauma to the scalp. Now, however, on further examination of JonBenét's body, where Dr. Mayer did an internal exam, other injuries were revealed. So the skull and the brain especially revealed a very different story from the external exam. Upon examination of the head, extensive bruising was found along the right side of the head, extending from around the front of the eye all the way to the back of the head. Associated with this bruising is a linear skull fracture that extends in the same fashion as the bruising. So what this means is externally there was bruising, and then when Dr. Mayer peeled back the skin, he found on the actual bone of the skull a linear skull fracture that matched the orientation of that external bruising. Now, Dr. Mayer took this a step farther and he cut back the skull cap. And what revealed when he did that was a subdural hemorrhage, or a pool of blood found again in the same orientation and same area as the external bruising and the fracture. So from the outside in, the external bruising, the skull fracture, and then more bruising underneath the skull. What a subdural hemorrhage is there is almost like a film around the brain, the dura, and this bleeding was underneath that film and in between that film and the actual brain itself. So again, Dr. Mayer took it a step farther, and under this hemorrhage, he found an extensive linear area of purple contusions or bruising. And that was found on the actual brain. Again, in the same orientation as the external bruising, the skull fracture, and the previously noted subdural hemorrhage. So he again took it a step further and he sampled the brain tissue in this area where there was the contusions, the purplish markings, and he looked at those areas under a microscope. And what he discovered was that there was disrupted or broken blood vessels and damaged neurons. So what does all of this mean? This means that JonBenét either hit her head or was hit in the head so hard that the damage penetrated through the scalp all the way down to the blood vessels and the neurons and the cells in the brain. So that's quite significant. Also found on the internal exam were a few abnormalities to her heart and lungs. Again, petechial hemorrhaging was discovered under the first layer of the front side of the heart, as well as the surface of both lungs. Pulmonary vascular congestion, or the buildup of fluids, was also found in the lungs. Now this was present on microscopic exam. However, regardless, pulmonary vascular congestion is not something that you should find or should be present in any healthy 6-year-old. The internal exam of the liver and other organs was unremarkable. Now the internal examination of the neck, despite what the external examination showed with the ligature marks and all the abrasions and petechial hemorrhaging. The internal examination of the neck actually revealed no hemorrhage or trauma to the muscles, bones, and cartilage in the neck. The hyoid bone especially or specifically is intact. However, on microscopic exam of the neck and chest, it revealed small fragments of parathyroid tissue in the thyroid. So what this means is the parathyroid and the thyroid is actually a gland that sits over your trachea right in the anterior portion of your neck. So small fragments of the parathyroid tissue were found in the thyroid. Again, pulmonary vascular congestion in the lungs, as previously noted, was discovered on microscopic exam, as well as vascular congestion to the thymus. Now, the thymus is located in the upper portion of your chest. Also of note on microscopic exam, a mild chronic inflammation of the submucosa of the trachea was discovered. Now, your trachea is your airway. It's oriented like this, and what this finding means was that there was some trauma, some inflammation to the tissue of your trachea. Your trachea is your airway. Now, apart from what we have already discussed, there are no other injuries listed in the autopsy report. So, in conclusion, Dr. Mayer ruled that the death of JonBenet a homicide. The cause of death is asphyxiation by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. We received a lot of important pieces of information from this autopsy report that is going to help us in figuring out what happened to JonBenet. It is clear from the report that sexual intentions played a key role in this crime and may be something that we need to look into as a possible motive. We want to look at behaviors of the males involved in JonBenet's life and who had the means to do this to her. We also learned from this report that JonBenet was killed by strangulation and trauma to her head. Now, JonBenet was a small young girl, but even a small person, it takes a lot of force, a lot of strength, a lot of effort to kill someone with your bare hands. So we can deduct that a lot of strength was needed to commit this crime, and possibly this strength came from anger or rage. Meaning we need to take into consideration who had the physical means or who was physically capable of doing this to her. Now, we also received a few pieces of evidence from the medical examiner's office that we should discuss. Evidence that was turned over to us include fibers and hairs from clothing and body surfaces, the actual ligatures that were tied around JonBenet's neck and wrist, the clothing JonBenet was found in, swabs and smears from the oral, vaginal, and anal areas, paper bags from JonBenet's hands and feet were returned back to us, as well as fingernail clippings. The jewelry that JonBenet was wearing, the necklace with the cross pendant, as well as the bracelet that was on her wrist, the white body bag that she was transported in, samples from her hair, her head hair, her eyelashes, and her eyebrows, swabs from the right and left thigh, swabs from the right cheek, and a red and purple top tubes of blood. Now, there's a lot of great evidence here, and we need to decide what we are going to do with it. It looks like Dr. Mayer already processed the tubes or the vials of blood looking for drugs and alcohol in JonBenet's system, which came back negative. Another piece of evidence I would like to process are the fibers and hair that were found on JonBenet. I'd like to further determine what the fibers are and where they came from, if they came from something that was of JonBenet's, or if it was something that was left on JonBenet from her attacker. It's also important to determine whose hair was found on JonBenet. If it's not her hair, it may help us determine or get a suspect and place them at the crime scene. Along these lines, I would like to further process JonBenet's clothing for the possibility of finding more trace evidence. I would also like to process the vaginal and rectal swabs and smears. as well as the swabs from the right and left thigh to see if we can get a DNA profile from any possible bodily fluids such as semen that may have been deposited on or in JonBenét. If we can prove through science who sexually assaulted her, we can make a strong case against that person as also having committed the murder. I would also like to process the ligatures for trace evidence and DNA. There may be skin cells left on it from the person who tied it. If they had tied it with bare hands, not using gloves, a transfer of DNA may have been left on the ligatures. And I would like to applaud Dr. Mayer for leaving the knots in the ligatures intact. This may have preserved any evidence that was present there. Also, I would like to swab or process the swab from the right cheek of JonBenét. It was of reddish brown in color and may potentially be blood. If we process it and we find that it's not JonBenét's blood, that it was a transfer from her attacker, then we may be able to again place a suspect at a crime scene or create a suspect list from someone that we weren't expecting before. The last thing I would really like to process are any substances found on the paper bags from JonBenét's hands and feet, as well as the finger clippings that we received from the medical examiner. If JonBenét at any point during this unfortunate attack fought back her attacker, then she may have been able to collect some DNA evidence from her attacker, skin cells, anything that we can use to potentially find who did this to her. So if there are no questions, this concludes my evaluation of the JonBenét Ramsey report, autopsy report. Thank you.